A tiny German shepherd puppy stood trembling in the snow, pressing its fragile body against an exhausted mother who could no longer rise. Cars had passed. No one had stopped. Then a former Navy SEAL saw the puppy's desperate eyes and noticed something strange. The puppy was not only guarding the mother, it kept running toward the forest, then turning back as if begging the soldier to follow. Why had the mother pushed herself so far through the storm? What was the puppy trying to lead him toward? And who, or what, was still waiting beyond the frozen trees? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Snow had been falling since before dawn over the White Mountains of New Hampshire, softening the pine-covered ridges and swallowing the narrow road north of North Conway. The world looked peaceful from a distance, but Mason Cole knew winter hid danger beneath beauty. At 43, Mason still carried himself like the Navy SEAL he had once been, tall, broad-shouldered, lean, and balanced with the quiet control of a man trained to cross unstable ground. His dark brown hair was cut short and silvered at the temples. A neatly trimmed beard sharpened his square jaw, while a pale scar beneath his left ear nearly vanished unless the light found it. Strangers often mistook his silence for coldness. After losing 2 teammates during an overseas rescue, Mason had become skilled at appearing when people needed him and leaving before gratitude became attachment. He helped neighbors, repaired generators without charge, and avoided every invitation that sounded like belonging. That morning, Mason was driving an old dark green pickup toward an emergency relay station that had stopped transmitting during the storm. Snow struck the windshield in white bursts, the radio hissed, and the forest seemed to close around him. Rounding a bend, Mason noticed a small shape beside the road. At first he thought it was a branch, then it lifted its head and barked. He braked and pulled over. An adult female German shepherd lay on her side in the snow. She appeared about 4 years old, though exhaustion made her look older. Her black and tan coat was matted with ice, and every rib showed faintly when she breathed. All 4 paw pads were torn and bleeding. There was no twisted limb or obvious wound from a vehicle. She looked less like an animal struck down than one that had spent every last measure of strength reaching this place. Across the mother's chest sat a German shepherd puppy, no more than 7 weeks old. The puppy was tiny, underweight, and almost swallowed by damp black and tan fur. One ear had begun to rise while the other folded sideways. The uneven ears only made the puppy seem painfully young. The little dog barked toward passing vehicles, then bent to lick the mother's muzzle. When a truck thundered by, the puppy pressed lower over her body, as though a few fragile pounds could shield her from wind and flying ice. Mason stepped outside. The cold struck his face like thrown sand. "Easy," he said, lowering himself several feet away. The puppy bared tiny milk teeth but did not flee. Its dark eyes held fear, exhaustion, and something that felt like judgment. Mason knew the human habit of noticing suffering, telling oneself someone else would stop, and continuing toward warmth. The sight touched an old wound. Mason had once believed courage meant reaching everyone in time. Experience had taught him that skill, strength, and prayer did not always prevent loss. Since leaving the service, he preferred machines because machines were honest. Find the damaged part, replace it, restore the signal. Living creatures carried histories that could not be repaired with a wrench. He retrieved the rescue blanket and approached slowly. The puppy barked until its voice cracked. Mason extended one gloved hand. After sniffing his fingers, the puppy caught his jacket cuff, tugged once, and ran toward the trees. 6 uneven steps later, it stopped and looked back. Then it hurried to the mother and barked again. "You want me to follow?" Mason whispered. In downtown North Conway, the storm had turned the windows of White Mountain Community Bank into gray mirrors. Margaret Sloan sat behind a polished walnut desk, signing a foreclosure notice. At 71, Margaret remained imposing despite her narrow frame. She was tall, straight-backed, and pale-skinned, with silver blonde hair twisted into a severe knot, and clear blue eyes that rarely revealed surprise. He wore charcoal suits, a small gold watch, and the controlled expression of a woman who had spent decades in rooms where women were expected to apologize before disagreeing. Employees respected her fairness, but feared her restraint. Margaret never raised her voice. She did not need to. The property listed on the papers was Lantern House, an aging home beyond the northern tree line. Payments were months overdue. Its electrical system had failed inspection, and the porch roof was unsafe beneath heavy snow. The legal reasons were plain enough. The private reason fit inside one name: Ruth Bennett. Ruth, now 78, had once been Margaret's closest friend. A broad-faced former nurse with auburn hair, warm brown eyes, and a habit of recognizing pain before people admitted it. 17 years earlier, something had broken between them. Neither woman had crossed the distance since. Margaret paused above the final signature line. For one moment, grief loosened the careful muscles of her face. Memories moved behind her eyes. Ruth laughing in a hospital corridor, Ruth arriving at Margaret's door with soup during a winter illness, Ruth standing beneath cold rain on the day their friendship ended. Margaret had spent 17 years convincing herself that silence was dignity. Yet silence, she had learned, could grow teeth. It could bite through affection, memory, and even mercy. Outside the bank, snow collected on parked cars and buried the sidewalks. Margaret looked toward the northern mountains, though Lantern House stood too far away to be seen. Her fingers tightened around the pen. She could have delayed the papers, she could have called Ruth, she could have asked whether the failing roof had been repaired or whether the woman who once noticed everyone else's pain had anyone noticing hers. Margaret signed. He placed the document inside a folder, aligned its edges with unnecessary care, and pressed the intercom button to summon an employee. When the door opened, Margaret's expression had already returned to its familiar stillness. She offered no explanation for the hesitation or for the faint tremor in her hand. Back beside the mountain road, Mason slid the rescue blanket beneath the unconscious mother and fashioned it into a drag sling. The puppy paced beside him, whining whenever he paused. Mason checked the mother's airway, secured her body, and prepared to pull her toward the truck. The puppy blocked him. It planted its small paws in the snow and barked sharply, then ran toward the forest again. Mason watched the puppy disappear between two pine trunks before returning almost immediately. The message was unmistakable now. The little animal was terrified of leaving its mother, but even more terrified that Mason might refuse to follow. Mason looked at the pickup. Warmth, medical supplies, and the road back to town waited less than 30 yards away. Every practical instinct told him to load the mother first and seek veterinary help. Yet the puppy's behavior did not belong to an animal merely seeking shelter. Something had driven the mother across miles of frozen ground until her paws tore open. Something remained behind. "All right," Mason said. "Show me." He tightened the blanket around the mother and followed the puppy into the forest. The little dog ran ahead, returned, then ran forward again, never allowing more than a few yards between them. Snow rose above Mason's boots, hidden roots caught at his feet, and branches clawed his jacket. The mother's weight dragged against his shoulders, but Mason kept moving, counting each breath and checking her whenever the puppy paused. Nearly a mile from the road, the puppy stopped beside a narrow service path blocked by a fallen pine. Its chest heaved, and its small legs shook beneath it. Mason stepped over the trunk and lifted his eyes. Beyond the rows of snow-covered trees stood an old house with dark windows and a porch sagging beneath the storm. One section of the roof had already collapsed. From the chimney, a thin ribbon of smoke lifted into the white air, faint and trembling, like the last breath of someone waiting to be found. The morning had grown darker beneath the storm by the time Mason Cole reached the old house beyond the fallen pine. Snow leaned against the walls in smooth white banks, and every window appeared dim and sealed, as though the building had closed its eyes against winter. The little German Shepherd puppy stood at the foot of the broken porch, barking until the sound became a raw, breathless rasp. Mason lowered the rescue blanket carrying the exhausted mother dog beneath the shelter of a crooked spruce. He checked the adult German Shepherd's breathing again. It remained shallow but steady. "Stay with her," Mason told the puppy, though he knew the command meant little to a frightened animal. The puppy pressed its nose against the mother's cheek, then looked toward the house. Mason had seen that look before, not in animals, but in young sailors waiting outside a damaged building while someone they loved remained inside. Fear had already decided what mattered. The body merely had to follow. The porch steps groaned under Mason's weight. A section of roof had collapsed near the eastern corner, burying an old rocking chair and splitting the railing. The front door was swollen shut by moisture and ice. Mason struck the wood with his shoulder once, then again. On the third impact, the latch tore free and the door swung inward through a drift of snow. Warmth did not meet him. Neither did silence. A chorus of anxious sounds rose from the dim hallway. Claws scratching wood, a hoarse bark, the metallic rattle of a cage, and the flutter of frightened wings. The air smelled of cedar shavings, old medicine, wet fur, and a wood stove that had nearly burned itself out. Mason stepped inside and immediately understood that Lantern House was not simply a residence. The front parlor had been transformed into a quiet ward for aging animals. A gray-muzzled Labrador lay on a padded mattress near the stove, the dog's hips narrow with age and one cloudy eye fixed hopefully on the doorway. Beside the mattress stood a small board marked with feeding times and arthritis medication. Two elderly cats occupied fleece-lined baskets beneath the window. One was a heavy orange tabby with a torn left ear and the offended expression of a retired judge. The other was a thin black female with silver hairs around her face, perhaps 16 years old, who watched Mason without moving. Framed photographs stood beside their beds. An old man holding the Labrador beside a fishing dock, a white-haired woman smiling with the orange cat in her lap, and a younger couple cradling the black cat beneath the Christmas tree. Farther down the hall, 3 wooden stands held cages for elderly birds. A green parakeet with missing tail feathers clung to a perch, while a small white cockatiel shivered beneath one wing. Each cage had a handwritten card with a name, preferred foods, and the telephone number of someone who could no longer keep the animal. Mason felt something tighten beneath his ribs. These were not abandoned pets. They were pieces of households that had broken apart through illness, age, and death. Someone had collected the living fragments and refused to throw them away. A sharp thud sounded from the rear of the house. "Hello?" Mason called. "Can you hear me?" A woman's voice answered faintly. "Pantry. Back room." Mason moved quickly but carefully, testing each section of floor before placing his full weight on it. The hallway ceiling had cracked and plaster littered the boards. He passed a narrow kitchen with overturned bowls, scattered cans, and a chair lying on its side. Beyond it, the pantry doorway was partially blocked by fallen timber. "I'm coming in," Mason said. "Mind the left side," the woman warned. Even trapped, her tone retained the firm practicality of someone accustomed to giving instructions during emergencies. "The shelf is holding more than it looks." Mason wedged himself through the gap. Ruth Bennett lay against the far wall beneath a broken ceiling beam. At 78, Ruth had a broad, expressive face softened by deep lines around the mouth and eyes. Her once auburn hair had faded to copper gray and escaped in loose strands from a careless braid. She was short and sturdily built, dressed in wool trousers, a thick blue sweater, and an old nurse's cardigan with one pocket torn open. Her warm brown eyes remained alert, despite pain and cold. One ankle was pinned beneath the beam, but there was no visible bleeding. Ruth's appearance suggested kindness, but not fragility. She looked like a woman who had spent decades lifting patients heavier than herself, arguing with doctors on behalf of frightened families, and carrying grief home without allowing it to sour her. Yet the house around her revealed the price of that strength. Ruth had continued caring for everyone until the roof itself had begun to fall. "How long have you been here?" Mason asked. "Since before dawn. Long enough to regret putting the emergency whistle in the kitchen." Mason almost smiled. "Can you feel your foot?" "Yes. Unfortunately, it has opinions." He examined the beam and the collapsed shelving. Ruth had placed folded blankets beneath the timber to reduce pressure on her ankle, a simple act that confirmed her medical training. Mason used a broken shelf board as a lever and shifted the beam just high enough for Ruth to pull free. She hissed through her teeth but did not cry out. "What happened?" he asked as he helped her sit upright. "The porch roof came down first. The sound frightened the animals. I was moving food and carriers away from the damaged side when part of the pantry ceiling followed." Ruth looked past him toward the hallway. "Is everyone alive?" "The animals I saw are alive." Ruth closed her eyes briefly, accepting relief in the careful way exhausted people accepted water. "And the shepherds?" Mason's attention sharpened. "You know them?" Ruth tried to rise, but her injured ankle folded beneath her. Mason caught her before she fell. He carried her through the hallway and set her in a wooden chair near the front door. Outside, the puppy heard Ruth's voice and began barking wildly. "Toby," Ruth whispered. The puppy scrambled across the porch, slipped on the ice, recovered with surprising dignity, and launched himself against Ruth's knees. Ruth bent with difficulty and gathered the tiny dog into her arms. Toby burrowed beneath her chin, whining so hard his whole body shook. Mason brought the adult German shepherd inside on the rescue blanket. The moment Ruth saw her, the steadiness left her face. "Sadie." Ruth reached down and placed both hands against the dog's neck. Sadie was a 4-year-old black and tan German shepherd with a narrow white scar across one paw, and intelligent amber eyes hidden beneath exhaustion. Sadie's coat had once been thick and glossy, but ice and hard travel had turned it dull and rigid. She opened her eyes at Ruth's touch, barely lifted her head, and let it fall against the woman's boot. "She was brought here 3 months ago," Ruth explained. "Her owner entered hospice care. Sadie arrived pregnant, frightened, and refusing food. Most of the litter didn't survive the first week. Toby was the only puppy strong enough to remain with her." Mason looked from the torn paw pads to the damaged porch. "How did they get outside?" "There's a low ventilation opening in the laundry room. When the roof began collapsing, I pushed Toby through because the front hall was blocked. Sadie forced the opening wider and followed. I thought she would stay nearby." Ruth's voice broke for the first time. "Instead, she must have understood I could not get out. She ran for help." Mason pictured Sadie crossing frozen ground, bleeding from every paw, carrying no map except instinct. Humans often liked to believe rescue belonged to them. Standing in Lantern House, Mason knew better. Sirens finally reached the road below. The volunteer rescue crew had followed the tire tracks of Mason's truck and the trail through the snow. While responders stabilized Ruth and prepared to transport Sadie and Toby to a veterinary clinic, Mason helped move the most vulnerable animals away from the damaged rooms. At White Mountain Community Bank, Margaret Sloan received the call from a junior loan officer named Ethan Bell. A slim, nervous man in his late 20s with wire-framed glasses and a careful manner shaped by years of trying not to disappoint authority. "Lantern House had a partial collapse," Ethan said. "Emergency crews are there." Margaret's hand tightened around the receiver. "How extensive is the structural damage?" Ethan hesitated. "I'm not sure." Ruth Bennett was inside. Only then did Margaret ask, "Is she alive?" After the call, Margaret opened the lowest drawer of her desk. Beneath old tax documents lay a faded red dog collar. The brass tag read, "Daisy." Margaret rubbed her thumb across the name, her face briefly stripped of discipline. When someone knocked, she shut the drawer so quickly the metal handle struck the wood. Back at Lantern House, paramedics lifted Ruth onto a stretcher. Before they carried her away, she caught Mason's wrist with surprising strength. "The blue ledger," Ruth said. "In my office. Did you see it?" Mason shook his head. The color drained from Ruth's face. "If that ledger disappears, dozens of promises will die with this house." By late morning, the snowfall had weakened over the northern edge of North Conway, leaving Lantern House beneath a pale sky and nearly 2 feet of fresh snow. Yellow safety tape crossed the damaged porch, and the eastern rooms remained closed behind temporary wooden barriers. A county building inspector had examined the surviving beams and allowed one brief entry into the western office, provided Mason Cole wore a hard hat and left at the first sign of movement in the roof. Mason returned with a flashlight, a canvas tool bag, and Ruth Bennett's warning still echoing in his mind. A damaged house could be repaired with lumber and money. A lost record of promises was another kind of ruin. Dr. Olivia Chen waited beside a dark blue veterinary van near the tree line. At 38, Olivia was a compact woman with warm beige skin, straight black hair cut just below her jaw, and observant dark eyes that missed very little. She wore insulated boots, a forest green parka, and narrow silver glasses that repeatedly slid down her nose when she was tired. Her calm voice could settle frightened owners as effectively as her hands settled frightened animals. Years earlier, Olivia had watched an elderly client surrender a beloved dog after emergency surgery because no relative would take responsibility. The dog had been adopted, but the old man had died believing he had failed his closest companion. Since then, Olivia had quietly helped Ruth with medical supplies whenever the clinic budget allowed. Toby sat inside a carrier on the passenger seat. The 7-week-old German Shepherd puppy had been cleaned and warmed, but his ribs still showed beneath his soft black and tan coat. One ear stood uncertainly, while the other folded sideways. He had eaten only a few bites since arriving at the clinic, and had spent the night clawing at the carrier whenever Sadie was taken beyond his sight. Sadie remained under observation with bandaged paws, fluids, and a warming blanket. Her condition was stable, though Olivia had warned that exhaustion sometimes revealed hidden complications after the immediate crisis passed. "He stopped crying when he heard your truck," Olivia told Mason. "Then he started trying to dismantle the carrier." Toby struck the wire door with one paw, as though confirming the accusation. Mason studied the puppy. "You brought him to a condemned house?" "I brought him to the safe side of a damaged house with a former Navy SEAL, a veterinarian, and written permission from the county." Olivia lifted one eyebrow. "He also needs to eat. Familiar scents may help." Mason opened the carrier. Toby climbed directly into his arms, sniffed his beard, then stared toward Lantern House. The puppy's body relaxed only slightly. Mason understood the feeling. Some people called a place home because it was safe. Others called it home because someone they loved was still connected to it. Inside, the building seemed quieter without Ruth's voice. Volunteers had already moved most of the animals to temporary foster homes and the church basement. Empty beds, labeled medicine trays, and shallow bowls remained behind like evidence of hurried departures. Toby pressed his nose to the floor and followed familiar scent trails down the hall. Olivia stayed near the doorway while Mason tested each board ahead of them. Ruth's office occupied a narrow room at the rear of the western wing. The ceiling had held, though a long crack ran above the window. Shelves bowed beneath binders, veterinary manuals, condolence cards, and small boxes marked with dates. Photographs covered nearly every wall. There were elderly women holding cats against hospital gowns, white-haired men seated in wheelchairs beside dogs with matching gray muzzles, and married couples standing on porches with animals centered proudly between them. Some photographs included handwritten notes. "Home after 12 weeks. She waited every afternoon." Or simply, "Together again." Mason had spent years around photographs of military teams, all straight backs and careful expressions, taken because danger taught people to preserve proof that they had once stood together. These pictures carried the same urgency. They were records of ordinary love before illness separated one life from another. He found the blue ledger inside a locked roll-top desk. The key hung beneath the desk in an old pill bottle, exactly where a retired nurse might hide something important while still making certain an emergency worker could locate it. The ledger was thick, cloth-bound, and worn pale along the edges. Several pages had water stains. Others held pressed flowers, clipped obituaries, or photocopies of adoption agreements. Each entry began with an animal's name and physical description, followed by medications, feeding habits, fears, favorite words, and the circumstances of arrival. Harvey, a 12-year-old Labrador, had belonged to a widower hospitalized after a stroke. Harvey slept only when an old fishing cap was placed beside his bed. Mabel, the orange cat with the torn ear, refused ceramic bowls but ate happily from a chipped blue saucer because her owner had used it for 11 years. Pepper, the black cat, had belonged to two sisters who entered assisted living on the same afternoon. Ruth had recorded not only illnesses, but the tiny rituals that made each animal feel known. In the margins were dates of reunions. Some entries ended with new family names. Others ended with a final visit at a hospital or nursing home. Beside those, Ruth had written whether the animal remained at Lantern House, entered another trusted home, or was buried beneath a maple tree with a collar and photograph. At the bottom of every completed page appeared the same sentence in Ruth's steady handwriting. No animal will be abandoned simply because the person who loves them cannot come home. Mason read it twice. The words unsettled him because they described a fear that rarely received a public name. People prepared wills for houses and savings, but many avoided speaking about the warm body that slept beside the bed. They feared not only death or illness, but the possibility that loyalty might be punished after they were gone. His phone vibrated inside his coat. The name on the screen was Mom. June Cole lived alone in southern Vermont, 3 hours away when the roads were clear. At 74, she was a slim woman with freckled fair skin, lively green eyes, and thick white hair cut in a practical chin-length bob. Age had narrowed her shoulders, but not her opinions. June had spent 30 years teaching elementary school and had developed the patient humor of someone accustomed to spilled paint, missing mittens, and children who believed whispering made a secret invisible. After her husband died, she had refused Mason's offer to move closer, saying independence was not the same as loneliness. "You sound like you're inside a refrigerator," June said when Mason answered. "I'm in a damaged house." "Of course you are. Other sons call from grocery stores." At her feet, Charlie gave a faint bark. The 13-year-old wire-haired terrier had coarse, tan fur, white eyebrows, and a heart condition that required medication twice each day. Charlie had belonged to Mason's father and had followed June from room to room since the funeral, stubbornly guarding her from delivery drivers, squirrels, and one suspicious garden rake. Mason told June about Lantern House, though he left out the worst details. There was a pause. "Mason, if I went to the hospital tomorrow, what would happen to Charlie?" "I'd come get him." "You work in the mountains. Sometimes no one knows where you are for a day." "I would make arrangements." "With whom?" Mason looked around at Ruth's photographs. He had no answer that did not depend on distance, weather, or another person agreeing at the last moment. June's voice softened. "I'm not asking because I plan to disappear. I'm asking because loving something means preparing for the day love needs help." The call ended a few minutes later, but her question remained. Lantern House was no longer merely Ruth's private act of kindness. It was a solution to a quiet terror his own mother carried. Toby had wandered beneath a tall cabinet while Mason spoke. The puppy suddenly began scratching at a loose floorboard, sneezing as dust rose around his nose. Mason knelt and pulled him back, but Toby returned immediately, digging with frantic purpose. Using a flat pry bar, Mason lifted the board. Beneath it lay a yellowed envelope wrapped in thin oilcloth. The paper carried Margaret Sloane's name in faded blue ink. Below it, someone had written, "For Margaret Sloane, when she is ready to forgive the dead." By early afternoon, the storm had thinned to a fine silver dust over North Conway, leaving the streets muffled and bright beneath a low winter sky. Mason Cole crossed the polished lobby of White Mountain Community Bank with the oilcloth-wrapped envelope inside his coat. He had changed out of his wet rescue gear, but melting snow still darkened the shoulders of his jacket, and the smell of cold pine followed him through the warm building. Customers glanced at his broad frame, close-cropped dark hair, and carefully trimmed beard before returning to their business. Mason had learned long ago that people often noticed the shape of a soldier before they noticed the man inside it. The same silence that once made frightened teammates trust him now made strangers move aside without being asked. Margaret Sloane's office stood behind a wall of clear glass at the rear of the bank. She was seated beneath a brass lamp, reviewing property documents with her silver blonde hair arranged in its usual severe knot. Nothing on her desk sat crooked. Even the pen beside her hand lay parallel to the edge of the blotter. Order had become more than a habit for Margaret. It was the fortress she had built after grief taught her that love could vanish without consulting the calendar. Her blue eyes settled on Mason when he entered. "Mr. Cole? You know who I am? This is a small town. Yesterday you were the man repairing mountain transmitters. Today you are the man who carried Ruth Bennett out of a collapsing house." Mason remained standing. "I found something in her office." He placed the envelope on the desk. Margaret did not touch it. For several seconds, she stared at the faded handwriting as though the paper had begun breathing. The discipline left her face by degrees. First the tightness around her mouth, then the steadiness in her eyes, then the rigid angle of her shoulders. "That is my sister's handwriting," she said. Anna Sloane had been 5 years younger than Margaret, and different from her in nearly every visible way. Where Margaret was tall and restrained, Anna had been small, softly built, and quick to smile. She had worn her chestnut-brown hair loose around a round, pale face sprinkled with freckles, even after chemotherapy thinned it. Anna laughed loudly, forgave quickly, and treated every ordinary pleasure as though it had been placed on earth specifically for her amusement. She had worked as a librarian and remembered not only what people borrowed, but why they needed it. Cancer had taken her strength slowly over 3 years, but it had never made her quiet. Mason slid the envelope closer. It was hidden beneath a floorboard. Margaret's gaze moved to the line beneath her name. "When she is ready to forgive the dead," she read without sound. "You should open it." "No." The answer came too quickly. Mason had heard that tone from men refusing medical attention because admitting pain seemed more dangerous than bleeding. Ruth wanted the ledger protected. This was hidden with it. Ruth always believed other people's lives were hers to arrange. "Is that why you're taking the house?" Margaret looked up sharply. "The bank is not taking anything. Lantern House is months behind on payments. The electrical system is unsafe, the roof has partially failed, and the owner ignored repeated notices. Sentiment does not change mathematics." "Neither does anger." A flicker of heat entered Margaret's eyes. "You have known Ruth Bennett for less than a day. I know the house was full of animals nobody else had made room for. You know what she allowed you to see." Mason waited. Silence had a way of asking questions more effectively than words. Margaret rose and turned toward the window. Snow lay over the town in smooth, forgiving shapes. From above, even neglected roofs looked clean. "Anna had a golden retriever named Daisy," she said at last. "A large, cream-colored female with a broad head, soft ears, and the unfortunate habit of stealing dinner rolls from unattended plates. Daisy was 7 when Anna's condition became terminal." Margaret's voice remained controlled, but her hands tightened behind her back. "In the final months, Anna could no longer walk the dog or manage the stairs. Ruth offered to keep Daisy at Lantern House temporarily. I believed the family should make a permanent decision. Anna needed to accept what was happening. We all did." "Did Anna ask Ruth to take her?" "She asked Ruth to promise Daisy would not be sent away." Margaret faced him. Ruth agreed. Then she encouraged Anna to speak as if she might return home. She brought photographs. She described Daisy waiting on the porch, She let my sister build hope around a future that did not exist. Maybe your sister knew that. Margaret's jaw tightened. You were not there. Mason thought of the ledger and its records of final visits. No. But sometimes hope isn't a prediction. Sometimes it's simply how a person gets through the night. Margaret returned to her desk and pushed the envelope toward him. Take it back. It has your name on it. So does the foreclosure file. She opened a folder and placed one finger against the notice. Lantern House has 10 days before the bank begins the sale process. That deadline will not change because Ruth kept an old letter under her floor. Mason studied her face. Margaret did not look cruel. Cruelty often carried pleasure or indifference. What he saw was a woman guarding pain so fiercely that everything near it had become an enemy. He left the envelope on her desk. Across town, Helen Price sat before a microphone at WNCR, a small local radio station operating above a hardware store. At 76, Helen was a short, full-figured widow with smooth brown skin, silver curls cut close around her face, and dark eyes that retained both humor and mischief. She favored bright scarves, red-framed reading glasses, and earrings shaped like tiny birds. Her husband of 48 years had died 3 winters earlier, leaving Helen with a quiet house and the dangerous temptation to stop being curious. Instead, she had accepted an early morning radio slot and turned it into the town's unofficial kitchen table. Helen had heard about Lantern House from a volunteer firefighter. By mid-afternoon, she changed the day's program. Let us talk about the question nobody likes to ask, she told her listeners. What happens to the animal sleeping beside you if age, illness, or bad luck takes you somewhere it cannot follow? The first caller was a thin-voiced woman named Carol, 79, who needed hip surgery but had postponed it twice because no one could care for her 2 elderly cats. The second was Walter Briggs, a broad-shouldered Vietnam veteran of 81, whose voice shook only when he described his German shepherd. The assisted living facility chosen by his daughter did not accept large dogs, so Walter had refused to move despite falling twice that winter. Then came an old man who would not give his name. His beagle slept at the foot of his bed. He had hidden chest pain from his son because he feared the dog would be taken to a county shelter if he entered the hospital. Helen did not lecture them. She listened. Between calls, she read a brief description of Lantern House and Ruth's work. By sunset, people who had once regarded the old property as an eccentric woman's private project began understanding it as an answer to a fear living behind many closed doors. The broadcast reached Margaret's office through a small radio Ethan Bell kept at his desk. Margaret heard the callers while reviewing the foreclosure file. Each voice seemed to loosen something she had fastened shut years before. Long after the employees left, Margaret remained alone beneath the brass lamp. The envelope waited where Mason had placed it. At last, she broke the seal. Anna's letter was brief. She wrote that Ruth had not promised recovery, only that Daisy would be loved for the rest of her life. She asked Margaret not to blame Ruth for offering kindness when medicine had nothing left to offer. The final line blurred beneath Margaret's tears. Please don't turn the pain of losing me into the reason another living soul loses its home. By nightfall, the storm returned to North Conway with a violence the mountains had been holding in reserve. Snow swept sideways across the streets. Power lines bowed beneath ice, and the familiar ridges disappeared behind a moving wall of white. The animals rescued from Lantern House had been placed temporarily in the basement of St. Matthew's Church, an old stone building near the center of town. The church basement was plain but warm, with low ceilings, painted concrete floors, and folding tables pushed against the walls to make room for padded beds and animal carriers. Reverend Thomas Hale had opened the building without hesitation. At 66, Thomas was a tall, stooped widower with a narrow face, a long gray mustache, and gentle hazel eyes behind square glasses. He spoke slowly, as if every sentence deserved time to arrive safely. Years of listening to families during funerals had taught him that grief rarely needed clever answers. Most of the time, it needed a chair, a cup of coffee, and someone willing to remain in the room. Mason had decided to stay overnight with the volunteers. Sadie had been released from Olivia Chan's clinic earlier that evening under strict instructions to remain warm and avoid unnecessary movement. The 4-year-old German Shepherd wore soft, protective wraps around all 4 paws, and her black and tan coat had regained some of its natural shine after being cleaned and dried. Exhaustion still hollowed the muscles along her sides, but her amber eyes were alert again. Toby slept against her belly beneath a wool blanket, one tiny paw resting over her foreleg. Around them, the elderly animals settled into uneasy sleep. Harvey, the Labrador, lay beside his owner's old fishing cap. Mabel, the orange cat, occupied a chair she had not been assigned and stared with royal suspicion at anyone who considered moving her. Pepper hid beneath a table. All the birds' cages were covered to reduce their fear of the wind. Mason rested in a narrow side room on an army cot, fully dressed except for his boots. He had learned in the SEAL teams that danger did not always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes it arrived as a change in pressure, a missing sound, or an animal suddenly refusing to lie still. That instinct woke him sometime after midnight. Sadie was barking. The sound carried through the basement in sharp, urgent bursts. She was not barking at the outer doors or the strange building. She stood at the entrance to the volunteers' sleeping room, scratching the wood with her bandaged front paws. Each movement had to hurt, but she continued. Mason sat up immediately. The room felt colder than before. "Sadie?" he said quietly, approaching her. "What is it?" She turned away from him, hurried toward the animal room, then looked back. The old pattern struck him at once. Sadie was not asking him to calm her. She was demanding that he notice something. Reverend Thomas emerged wearing flannel pajama trousers beneath his winter coat. "The generator stopped," he said. His breath had begun to show in the air. "I thought it was only for a moment." Mason checked the electrical panel. The backup generator had failed completely, and the heating system had shut down with it. A wall thermometer showed the basement temperature falling faster than expected. The outer storm had driven the cold deep into the stone foundation. Then Mason heard a faint metallic ticking from the far corner. A water pipe ran along the exterior wall above the animal beds. Frost had already formed around one joint. The pipe had begun to freeze, and the expanding pressure was working against old metal. "We have to move everyone," Mason said. Thomas looked toward the snow-covered stairwell. "Move them where?" "Upstairs first, away from this wall." The volunteers woke quickly. One of them was Linda Mercer, a 69-year-old retired postal worker with broad shoulders, cropped white hair, and a ruddy face that always seemed warmed by outdoor air. Linda had spent 32 years delivering mail through New England winters and possessed little patience for complaints about weather. She handled frightened animals with blunt tenderness, calling every dog honey while issuing orders like a drill instructor. Mason assigned carriers and routes. Thomas cleared the sanctuary above. Linda gathered blankets. 2 younger volunteers carried the bird cages while Mason lifted Harvey onto a canvas stretcher. Toby tried to follow Sadie but slipped on the concrete, so Linda tucked the puppy inside her coat. Sadie refused to leave until the last animals were moving. The pipe split seconds after Mason carried Pepper's basket up the stairs. Water burst across the basement wall, pouring onto the beds and spreading over the floor. Within minutes, the temporary shelter became unusable. The church sanctuary remained warmer, but not warm enough for an entire night without power. The stained glass windows rattled under the wind, and cold air slipped beneath the wooden doors. Thomas called every emergency shelter in the area. The school gymnasium was full of families whose homes had lost heat. The community center had no space left. Olivia's clinic was operating on limited power and already crowded with urgent cases. Mason stood near the altar with Sadie beside him and felt the old pressure of impossible choices. During military operations, he had learned to reduce every crisis to priorities: immediate threat, available resources, fastest route out. Yet living beings did not fit neatly into plans. Harvey needed warmth for his joints. The birds could not tolerate prolonged cold. Several animals required medication at precise times. There were too many to scatter safely across unfamiliar homes in the middle of a blizzard. At White Mountain Community Bank, Margaret Sloan had not gone home. The storm had stranded several employees, and the bank's commercial generator kept the building fully heated. Ethan Bell listened to emergency radio reports from the reception desk while Margaret sat alone in her office, Anna's letter open beneath the brass lamp. "The church shelter failed," Ethan said from the doorway. His wire-framed glasses were fogged, and anxiety sharpened his thin face. "They're trying to relocate the Lannon House animals." Margaret looked toward the large conference room across the hall. It was empty except for a long table and 12 upholstered chairs. The bank's emergency policies forbade animals inside except certified service dogs. Insurance rules mentioned sanitation, property damage, allergies, and liability. Margaret had written many of those policies herself. She lifted the telephone and called the regional board chairman. He answered from a hotel in Boston and refused permission before she finished explaining. "The conference room is not a kennel," he said. "The risk is unacceptable." Margaret looked down at Anna's final line. For 17 years, she had treated control as proof that she had survived grief. Now control appeared smaller than cowardice. She hung up. "Clear the conference room," she told Ethan. His eyes widened. "The board said no. I heard them. Mrs. Sloan, they could hold you personally responsible. They may do so." Margaret removed her charcoal jacket, rolled up the sleeves of her white blouse, and began moving chairs herself. Ethan joined without another question. They spread old promotional blankets across the carpet, brought shallow bowls from the staff kitchen, and covered electrical outlets. Margaret unlocked the front doors with her own key. When Mason's truck arrived, followed by the church van and Olivia's vehicle, Margaret stood beneath the entrance lights as snow gathered in her silver blonde hair. The woman who had signed the papers threatening Lantern House now held the door open for every animal that had lost its temporary refuge. Harvey was carried in first. The cats followed, then the birds. Toby emerged from Linda's coat and immediately began inspecting the polished lobby with the confidence of a puppy who believed all buildings existed for his investigation. Sadie entered last beside Mason. The German Shepherd moved carefully on her wrapped paws. She passed Ethan, Olivia, Thomas, and the waiting volunteers. Then she stopped directly in front of Margaret. Sadie raised her tired head and rested it gently against the older woman's knee. Margaret's hands hovered above the dog, as if afraid to touch a memory. At last she lowered one palm onto the damp fur between Sadie's ears, her face folded with 17 years of grief. "Daisy," Margaret whispered, "I'm sorry." The morning after the storm arrived clear and bitter over North Conway, with sunlight flashing across broken branches and ice-coated roofs. Lantern House stood beneath that hard blue sky like an old ship driven onto rocks. Snow had been cleared from the porch, but the damage looked worse in daylight. One corner of the roof sagged inward, exposed wiring hung behind cracked plaster, and the eastern wall had shifted enough to leave a narrow black seam beneath the eaves. Mason Cole stood in the yard beside Ruth Bennett, while the county inspector completed his examination. Ruth leaned on a borrowed cane, her injured ankle wrapped beneath a heavy boot. Her copper-gray hair was pinned carelessly beneath a knitted hat, and the exhaustion in her brown eyes made her look older than 78. Even so, she watched every measurement as though determination alone might persuade the house to stand straighter. The inspector, Caleb Norris, was a broad, square-bodied man of 58, with weather-reddened cheeks, close-cut gray hair, and a carpenter's thick hands. He had spent 20 years rebuilding homes before an injured shoulder pushed him into county work. That history made him less eager than most officials to condemn old buildings, but it also made him unwilling to offer comforting lies. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking. "The western wing can be stabilized," Caleb said. "The eastern roof must be replaced, not patched. The electrical system needs a complete upgrade. You also need a proper isolation room for sick animals, improved ventilation, accessible exits, and legal non-profit registration before animals can return. Ruth's fingers tightened around the cane. How much? Caleb gave a figure that emptied the expression from her face. Mason had heard larger numbers attached to military equipment and rescue aircraft, but those numbers had belonged to governments, budgets, and institutions built to absorb loss. This one belonged to an elderly woman with an overdue mortgage and a house full of promises. Ruth looked toward the porch where Sadie rested on a blanket beside Toby. The German Shepherd mother's paws remained wrapped, though she could now stand for short periods. Toby sat against her shoulder, one ear upright and the other still bent, watching the adults as if finances were merely another human problem he might solve by chewing it. I have some savings, Ruth said quietly. You have enough for temporary bracing, Mason replied. Not the roof, electrical work, permits, and medical room. Ruth's chin lifted. Then I will sell the furniture. The furniture would barely cover the inspection fees. She looked at him sharply, resenting the truth because she could not argue with it. Mason recognized that pride. It was the same armor he wore whenever someone offered help before he had exhausted himself proving he did not need it. That afternoon, Mason drove to the small cabin his father had left him on the southern edge of town. The one-story structure stood beside a frozen creek, built from dark cedar logs and roofed in green metal. His father had repaired it slowly over 30 years, replacing one window at a time, carving shelves by hand, and marking the height of Mason's childhood on the pantry door. After his father died, Mason kept the cabin but rarely slept there. Too many ordinary memories lived inside it. Coffee before sunrise, work gloves drying beside the stove, June laughing when Charlie stole a strip of bacon. Mason understood emergencies better than inheritance. A burning building told a person what to do. A quiet room asked harder questions. He sat at the kitchen table and calculated the likely sale value. The cabin would not fund every repair, but it could begin the work and persuade contractors that Lantern House had real support. By evening, Mason had drafted a message to a local real estate office. Before sending it, he called June. His mother listened without interrupting. Charlie's rough bark sounded once in the background, followed by June telling the old terrier to stop threatening the mail slot. You're selling your father's cabin, she said at last. It's property I barely use. It is also the only place in North Conway where you have allowed yourself to leave more than one change of clothes. That isn't relevant. It is painfully relevant. Mason leaned back and stared at the height marks on the pantry frame. Ruth needs money now. Committees and donations take time. June's voice remained gentle, which made her words harder to dismiss. You always do this. Do what? You arrive when something is falling apart. You lift the beam, stop the bleeding, repair the transmitter, carry the frightened thing to safety. Then, when the work becomes slow and ordinary, you leave before anyone can ask you to belong to what comes next. Mason said nothing. You think selling the cabin is sacrifice, June continued. Maybe it is, but perhaps it is also escape. You can hand Ruth money, call the mission complete, and return to being alone. I'm trying to save the house. No, Mason. You are trying to save it by yourself. The sentence struck more cleanly than an accusation. Mason had spent years believing self-reliance protected others from disappointment. His teammates had once trusted him with their lives, and losing two of them had left a private verdict inside him. Anyone depending on Mason eventually paid for it. Since then, he had offered usefulness instead of closeness. A repaired roof could not abandon him. A completed rescue could not ask why he never stayed for dinner. What should I do? He asked. June's answer came without triumph. Let the town decide whether the promise matters to them. Courage is not only carrying weight. Sometimes it is admitting the weight requires more hands. That evening, the town council held an emergency meeting in the community hall. Folding chairs filled quickly with volunteers, elderly residents, bank employees, church members, and callers who had heard Helen Price's broadcast. Ruth sat in the front row beside Olivia Chen while Sadie rested near Mason's feet. Toby moved between chair legs until Linda Mercer caught him attempting to investigate a handbag containing peppermint candy. Margaret Sloane stood before the council table. She wore her charcoal suit, but the severe knot in her silver blonde hair had loosened, leaving several strands near her face. In her hands were the foreclosure documents and Anna's letter. "The bank has the legal right to proceed with the sale of Lantern House," Margaret began. Murmurs moved through the room. "The debt is real. The safety violations are real. But I must also state publicly that my judgment was not untouched by personal resentment." Ruth's face became still. Margaret looked directly at her. "For 17 years, I blamed Ruth Bennett for choices my sister made at the end of her life. I allowed that blame to harden into certainty. When Lantern House began failing financially, I treated the situation as proof that Ruth's work had always been foolish." The confession appeared to cost Margaret more than money ever had. Her hands trembled, but she did not hide them. "I propose that White Mountain Community Bank freeze the debt for 6 months," she continued. "During that period, I will assist in forming a registered nonprofit foundation, establishing transparent accounts, and organizing a community repair fund." Ruth's expression held pain rather than gratitude. 6 months does not return 17 years. "No," Margaret said. "Nothing will. Nor does one speech erase what you intended to do. I know." The hall grew quiet. Mason understood that reconciliation was not a door swinging open. It was a damaged bridge, tested one careful step at a time. Ruth studied Margaret for a long moment. "You may help with the foundation," she said. "That is not forgiveness." "I did not expect it to be." A volunteer near the wall opened a can of white paint to test a sample board for the future isolation room. Toby escaped Linda's hands, seized the paintbrush by its wooden handle, and raced across the hall. Tiny white paw prints followed him over the dark floor and directly across Margaret's polished shoes. Ruth stared at the ruined shoes. Then she laughed. The sound was surprised, rusty, and warm. Margaret looked down at Toby, who stood proudly with white paint on his nose. A moment later, Margaret laughed too. For the first time in 17 years, the wall between the two women developed a crack, wide enough for light to enter. Spring had not yet reached North Conway, but the morning light had begun to linger longer over the White Mountains. Snow still lined the roadside in gray-white ridges, and Lantern House remained wrapped in scaffolding, tarps, and the cheerful confusion of too many volunteers carrying tools in every direction. The old house no longer looked like something waiting to collapse. It looked like something learning how to stand again. Mason Cole arrived before sunrise each day, but he no longer climbed the scaffolding before anyone else could stop him. Instead, he stood beside a folding table in the yard with construction plans, volunteer schedules, safety checklists, and 3 cups of coffee that he repeatedly forgot to drink. At 43, Mason still possessed broad shoulders, controlled movements, and watchful dark eyes of a former Navy SEAL. Yet something in his posture had changed. He was no longer braced to leave. He had begun giving people tasks without following behind to redo them. He had begun accepting the possibility that another person's hands could be steady too. The roofing crew was led by Frank Delaney, a 64-year-old Navy veteran with a barrel chest, a weathered square face, and a thick white beard that collected sawdust like snow. Frank had lost part of the hearing in his left ear during his service and compensated by speaking loudly enough for the entire mountain to understand him. He was blunt, impatient with poor measurements, and unexpectedly gentle with frightened animals. Beneath him worked 6 other veterans, each carrying private scars they rarely named. They replaced the eastern roof 1 section at a time, calling out measurements, arguing about nails, and laughing whenever Toby appeared with an item someone had just put down. Toby had grown stronger over the weeks, though the German Shepherd puppy remained small for his age. His black and tan coat had become soft and glossy. One ear now stood proudly while the other continued to lean at an uncertain angle, and his confidence had expanded far beyond the limits of his body. He stole Frank's left glove 3 times in one morning, dragged a measuring tape beneath the porch, and attempted to bury a volunteer's sandwich beside a snowbank. When Mason recovered the sandwich, Toby sat beside the hole with an expression of wounded innocence. Sadie rested in the center of the yard on a thick blanket where sunlight reached through the bare maple branches. The 4-year-old German Shepherd had regained weight, and the torn pads of her paws had healed into tender new skin. She watched the rebuilding with calm amber eyes, lifting her head whenever Mason moved too far away or Toby entered a place where puppies were clearly not welcome. Sadie no longer needed to run until her body failed. Even so, she continued counting every person who entered the yard, as though responsibility had become part of her bones. Inside the house, Daniel Ruiz rewired the western rooms. Daniel was a 46-year-old master electrician with a lean, muscular build, close-cropped black hair, a trimmed salt and pepper goatee, and deep brown eyes made serious by years of careful work. His younger sister had once lost her apartment after a prolonged illness and had been forced to surrender 2 cats because no temporary foster arrangement existed. Daniel had never forgotten how her voice changed whenever she spoke of them. He donated every Saturday to Lantern House and refused payment, saying electricity was easier to repair than regret. In the dining room, elderly women from Helen Price's radio audience sewed washable cushions for the animals. They formed an informal group called the Silver Needles, though Linda Mercer claimed the name made them sound like either a sewing circle or a criminal organization. Their leader, Dorothy Mills, was an 80-year-old former dressmaker with tiny hands, warm brown skin, thick silver braids coiled above her neck, and a sense of humor sharpened by widowhood. Dorothy measured fabric with perfect precision and threatened to sew Toby's stolen gloves together if he did not return them. Outside, students from North Conway Middle School painted the new fence and helped build a wide access ramp for elderly dogs and visitors using wheelchairs. Their teacher, Grace Holloway, was a tall, freckled woman of 35 with curly red hair and a patient voice that became frighteningly firm around open paint cans. Grace had grown up with a disabled grandmother and believed children learned compassion most deeply when given real work instead of speeches. By noon, several students had paint on their coats. One had painted the same fence board 4 times, and all of them had learned to move aside when Harvey, the old Labrador, decided a particular patch of sunlight belongs to him. Mason coordinated the crews from the yard, answering questions and solving problems without taking every hammer into his own hands. The first few days had felt unnatural. When Frank asked another veteran to secure a roof beam, Mason's instinct had been to climb up and check it himself. When Daniel tested the electrical panel, Mason had stood too close, watching every wire. Gradually, Mason noticed what his vigilance cost the people helping him. Trust offered and immediately reclaimed was not trust at all. One evening, Frank found Mason alone beneath the scaffolding, inspecting a support already approved by the county. "You planning to marry that beam?" Frank asked. "Checking the bolts?" "I checked them. Caleb checked them." "God probably checked them while we were eating lunch." Mason looked up at the repaired roof. "I'm used to being responsible when things fail." "So am I," Frank said, his loud voice softening. "But there's a difference between responsibility and pretending nobody else is capable." The next morning, Mason left the beam alone. June Cole arrived from Vermont near the end of the month, driving a small blue station wagon with Charlie secured in the passenger seat. At 74, June remained slim and upright, with freckled skin, lively green eyes, and white hair cut in a practical bob. Charlie, her 13-year-old wire-haired terrier, had coarse tan fur, white eyebrows, and a heart condition that had slowed his legs without improving his opinion of strangers. He climbed from the car, barked once at Frank's beard, and then sat down as though exhausted by the burden of security. June entered the temporary office where Margaret had organized the new emergency care records. She completed a backup care form listing Charlie's medication, veterinarian, feeding routine, favorite blanket, and habit of refusing pills unless hidden in cream cheese. June had no intention of surrendering him. The document existed for a different reason. If illness carried her away without warning, Charlie would be taken somewhere familiar rather than treated as a problem no one had prepared to solve. Mason watched his mother sign the form. "Does this make you feel better?" "It makes me feel responsible," June said. "Those are not always the same thing." Later that afternoon, Margaret found Ruth in the restored parlor sorting old photographs. The two women still spoke carefully, as though every sentence crossed thin ice. "What happened to Daisy?" Margaret asked. Ruth paused, then opened a cupboard and removed a small cedar box. "She lived 4 years after Anna died." Margaret closed her eyes. "I wrote to you," Ruth continued. "I invited you to visit. You returned every letter unopened. I thought seeing Daisy would make losing Anna worse." "It might have," Ruth said. "It might also have reminded you that love had not vanished simply because Anna had." Inside the box were Daisy's faded red collar, photographs of the golden retriever sleeping beside Ruth's fireplace, and handwritten notes recording her final years. Daisy had developed arthritis, learned to steal tomatoes from the garden, and waited beside the front door every evening at the time Anna once came home from work. Ruth had remained with her during her final night. Margaret pressed the collar against her palm. Ruth did not comfort her, but neither did she leave. For the first time, they shared the grief instead of standing on opposite sides of it. Several weeks later, the restored Western Wing passed its inspection for limited emergency care. The first visitor arrived before the paint had fully dried. Evelyn Harper was an 82-year-old widow with a delicate, stooped frame, translucent, pale skin, and soft, white hair tucked beneath a lavender wool hat. Her blue-gray eyes were intelligent but exhausted. She had spent most of her life working as a bookkeeper and had developed the habit of apologizing whenever she needed help. Evelyn was scheduled to begin months of cancer treatment in Boston. At her side stood Rosie, a 13-year-old beagle with long velvet ears, a white muzzle, and a round body softened by age. Rosie leaned against Evelyn's ankle, trusting that wherever the leash went, home would follow. Evelyn's hand would not release the handle. "I promised her I would never leave her," she whispered. "She slept beside my husband when he was dying. Now I am handing her to strangers." Mason knelt beside Rosie. The old beagle sniffed his fingers, then rested her chin against his knee. "You are not leaving her," Mason said. "You are making sure your love keeps caring for her while you cannot." Evelyn looked toward Sadie resting near the doorway, Toby peering from behind her shoulder, and June standing beside Charlie's completed care file. Slowly, Evelyn opened her fingers. The leash settled into Mason's hand. 1 year later, winter returned to North Conway with gentler hands. Snow settled over the white mountains in clean, white folds, softened the fence posts, and gathered along the broad new ramp leading to the house once known simply as Lantern House. Above the restored porch hung a carved wooden sign painted deep blue and gold, Second Promise Sanctuary. The eastern roof stood straight beneath the snowfall. Warm light glowed through insulated windows, and the old chimney sent a steady ribbon of smoke into the pale morning sky. The building no longer looked like a place fighting collapse. It looked like a place prepared to receive whatever sorrow arrived at its door. Inside, the sanctuary followed a quiet rhythm, shaped by both care and memory. One wing provided temporary rooms for animals whose elderly owners were hospitalized or recovering from surgery. Another held long-term residents whose people had entered assisted living or died without relatives able to keep them. When reunions were possible, every effort was made to preserve them. When they were not, carefully screened families were chosen, with Ruth insisting that affection alone was not enough. Patience, stability, and respect for old habits mattered just as much. Ruth Bennett, now 79, remained the founder and moral center of the sanctuary. Her copper-gray hair had grown softer around her broad face, and she still walked with a slight limp from the accident, though she rejected the cane on all but icy days. Ruth remembered every animal's medication, favorite blanket, and preferred sleeping position, but she had finally learned to let younger volunteers lift the heavy crates. She called this wisdom. Mason called it progress. Ruth usually responded that he had no right to lecture anyone about accepting help. Margaret Sloan managed the foundation's finances from a small office overlooking the front yard. At 72, she still dressed with the restrained elegance of a bank director, but the severe charcoal suits now shared space with knitted cardigans and sensible boots. Her silver blonde hair was often pinned less tightly, and the sharpness in her blue eyes had eased without disappearing. Margaret had created emergency funds, transparent donation records, and legal agreements that protected both owners and animals. She still believed in order, but no longer mistook order for mercy. Dr. Olivia Chen directed medical care from the new isolation room, a bright, ventilated space with washable walls, heated floors, and shelves organized with near-military precision. At 39, Olivia remained compact and calm, with straight black hair at her jaw and silver glasses that slipped down her nose whenever she worked too long. She trained volunteers to recognize pain, dehydration, and fear before those conditions became crises. More importantly, she reminded them that old animals did not need pity. They needed dignity, routine, and time. Mason Cole had become the sanctuary's operations director. At 44, the former Navy SEAL still carried the broad-shouldered strength, close-cropped dark hair, and trimmed beard that made strangers assume he was harder than he was. The scar beneath his left ear remained faint, but the guarded distance in his expression had changed. Mason continued servicing emergency relay stations and serving with the mountain rescue team, yet he returned to Second Promise after every call. He repaired doors, coordinated volunteers, drove animals to medical appointments, and sat with frightened owners who needed someone to tell them that asking for help was not betrayal. The difference was not that Mason had stopped rescuing. He had stopped disappearing afterward. Sadie and Toby lived permanently at the sanctuary. Sadie had become a strong, graceful German shepherd with a glossy black and tan coat, steady amber eyes, and pale scars across the pads of her paws. She spent most mornings near the reception room, where newly arrived animals could see her calm body and hear her slow breathing. Nervous dogs often settled when she lay beside their carriers. Cats generally pretended not to notice her, though more than one had eventually fallen asleep against her back. Toby had grown into a lanky young German shepherd with oversized paws, a bright black saddle across his tan coat, and one ear that stood perfectly while the other leaned slightly outward. The crooked ear gave him the appearance of listening to two different conversations at once. Age had strengthened his body without improving his judgment. Visitors routinely lost gloves, scarves, pens, and, once, an entire knitted hat, all of which were later discovered beneath the porch. Mason had placed a wooden box near the entrance labeled Toby's borrowed property, though Toby seemed to regard the box as proof that his work had become officially recognized. Helen Price's radio program now included a weekly segment called The Second Promise. At 77, Helen still wore red-framed glasses, bright scarves, and bird-shaped earrings while speaking into the microphone with the warmth of a woman inviting the entire county into her kitchen. Each week, she read a story about an older person and an animal whose future had once seemed uncertain. She never turned the stories into tragedy for entertainment. She focused instead on practical compassion. Emergency contact cards, temporary foster plans, medication lists, and the courage required to prepare before a crisis. The program had inspired similar efforts in two neighboring counties. June Cole visited nearly every month with Charlie. At 75, June remained slim and lively, her freckled face framed by a white bob, and her green eyes still quick with humor. Charlie, now 14, moved slowly on his stiff legs and required 3 heart medications. But he continued treating every delivery truck as a personal threat. His emergency care file had become the model Mason used when helping other families prepare. June often sat in the kitchen with Ruth, comparing teaching stories and arguing about whether Toby was charming or criminal. Ruth insisted both could be true. In the reception room, Margaret had hung a framed photograph of Anna and Daisy. Anna stood in summer sunlight with chestnut hair around her freckled face, while the cream-colored golden retriever leaned against her legs with a stolen dinner roll in her mouth. Daisy's faded red collar rested in a shadow box beneath the photograph. Margaret no longer kept either memory hidden in a drawer. Her friendship with Ruth did not return to what it had once been. Too much time had passed, and too many letters had been refused. Instead, they built something new. They disagreed openly, apologized without ceremony, and occasionally sat together in silence without treating silence as punishment. It was slower than forgiveness in stories and more honest than forgetting. On a snowy morning near the anniversary of the rescue, Sadie slept on the porch beneath a thick wool blanket. Toby sat close beside her, watching flakes gather along the railing. After a moment, the young German shepherd placed one paw gently over his mother's shoulder. Sadie opened one amber eye, then lowered her head again, accepting the protection as though she remembered a smaller body once trying to shield her beside a mountain road. A pale gray sedan stopped outside the gate. An elderly woman stepped carefully onto the snow. Clara Whitmore was 84, short and delicate, with soft brown skin, white curls beneath a navy hat, and dark eyes swollen from several sleepless nights. She wore a long wool coat over hospital clothes and held an old cat against her chest inside a green knitted blanket. The cat, Lacey, was an 18-year-old calico with a narrow face, cloudy golden eyes, and patches of orange, black, and white fur, thinned by age. Clara had been admitted for heart surgery scheduled the following morning. Her daughter lived overseas, and every other arrangement had failed. Clara reached the porch but could not make herself knock. Mason opened the door before she tried. Behind him, golden light fell across small beds, labeled medicine baskets, framed photographs, and the blue ledger resting open on the reception table. "I was told this place might take her," Clara said. Shame bent her voice. "Only until I can come back."
"I promised she would never be alone."
Lacey lifted her head weakly and pressed closer beneath Clara's chin. Mason stepped aside and opened the door wider. "You brought her to the right place," he said. Toby hurried forward to greet them, caught one long leg in a mound of snow, and disappeared nose first into the drift. He rose immediately, shook himself, and continued toward Clara with the solemn dignity of a dog, certain no one had witnessed anything. For the first time that morning, Clara smiled. Inside, Ruth prepared a warm bed. Olivia reached for Lacey's medical papers. Margaret opened a new page in the blue ledger. Sadie remained near the doorway, calm and watchful. And in the heart of winter, the old house made room once more for a love that needed someone else to carry it for a while. Sometimes the miracle is not that the storm disappears. Sometimes it is that God places the right heart on the right road at the right moment. A frightened puppy, an exhausted mother, a wounded veteran, and two women separated by grief became part of the same answer. This story reminds us that love needs more than good intentions. It asks us to prepare, to forgive, to notice the quiet fears of older people, and to make room for the animals who have become family. Mason learned that strength is not carrying every burden alone. Margaret learned that grief can become cruelty when it is never faced. Ruth showed that faith often looks like keeping a promise when nobody is watching. Perhaps God's greatest miracles arrive through ordinary hands that choose not to walk away. Share this story with someone who believes compassion can rebuild what sorrow has broken. Tell us in the comments which moment touched your heart most, and subscribe for more stories of hope, loyalty, and second chances. May God protect you, your family, and every faithful animal waiting beside you.